Welcome to A State of Mind. My name is Paul John Dykes, and today I'm joined by Brett Rowden, who is coming from, it started in the north. Now, if you don't know what that is, you will find out during this discussion. Brett, welcome to A State of Mind.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
How do you like the studio?
I love it. It's very professional. A lot more so than I kind of thought. I wasn't sure what to expect, to be fair, but no, I'm really impressed.
I'm glad to hear that. I mean, what we try to do here is encapsulate all our tastes, all our interests and influences, and that takes in art, music, literature, football, culture, and bring it all together into what you see when you walk in the front door there. But what we also want to do is we want to open this up to people who are maybe doing something similar, and I think in many ways you are, and we'll get to what you're doing down at Easter Road. But before we do that, talk to us. We were having a wee chat there. Talk to us about the mod movement and how you got into that yourself.
Well, I like the mod movement, as you say there, because a lot of people call it the mod scene. I think it's still going. It's still very much going strong. Like if you look at, like recently it was Brighton Mod Weekend, which unfortunately I didn't make it down to, but hundreds of people, if not thousands of people turned up, which obviously under the current circumstances is a pretty major deal, I think, to be fair, with social distancing and whatnot. But I mean, with the mod movement, for anyone who doesn't really know, it started obviously sort of late 50s, early 60s, with groups of people in Soho, London, who basically got into sort of modernist jazz music at a time when sort of traditional jazz was more popular. And then from there, it kind of cut into soul music, which obviously became a bit of a mainstay within the mod scene. But beyond that, it was fashion. So, Italian suits, that was a big thing. The sort of Ivy League look from America. So I always loved the idea of like the early mods were literally picking up their sort of style influences from record covers. So guys like Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, stuff like this, picking up like fashion tips from that and going with it. And obviously this is at a time in sort of late 50s, early 60s, sort of England at that time where there wasn't really too much, on show in terms of fashion. There wasn't really a lot there. So, it was tough for people to get hold of clothes, tough for people to get hold of records, like import records from America. But then obviously from then on, the mod scene kind of grew, kind of splintered a little bit. You had sort of Northern Soul scenes going on in the 70s. Then later the mod revival, inspired by obviously Mr. Paul Weller and the Jam. So that came sort of late 70s. And ever since then, there's been sort of various they call them mod revivals, but I don't think that's even a fair point now because there's been so many of them. It's just a continuous movement with spikes. And so obviously another obvious example would be sort of Britpop, Oasis, the Gallaghers, and the early 90s. And I genuinely believe since then it's not gone away. So I think there's plenty of people like myself. I'm probably from the post-Oasis generation and still very much into that. That's how I got into it. And obviously more modern bands as well. So yeah, it's a mod movement. It's still going on. It's still going strong, no matter what some people might tell you.
Yeah, definitely. I remember the famous Paul Weller interview. I think it was Jonathan Ross back in probably the 90s, maybe the early 90s. He says, "I'll always be a mod.
Yeah.
You can bury me a mod." That's the thing with the movement. A scene for me, something that comes and goes. It comes, it has a wee burst, and it disappears. But the mod movement continually is there, and it transcends generations. So you're post-Oasis, I was pre-Oasis, mate. I was there before Oasis, and it was great to see that movement. It was labelled Britpop, and I think it was labelled Britpop by the music magazines at the time, who were very influential, which is interesting in this time, this day and age, because you never ever thought you'd see a day where the NME magazine or newspaper, as it was, didn't exist. And we used to buy the NME and not even hear some of the music we were buying. That sounds incredible now, eh?
Yeah, it's completely different, isn't it? Where if you've got everything readily available now, which has changed everything, you know what I mean? From, like I was saying about early mods there, using record covers for, style tips and that. You're never going to see that because you've got Google on your phone now, you know what I mean? So it's just the way of the world now.
It's pros and cons because we utilise it so much. I mean, we're going to be speaking about your own brand and your own business.
Yeah.
And part of that has got to be utilising social media and the use of smartphones, and you're tied to it.
It's got to be done in business.
It's got to be done.
You can't avoid it as much as I'd probably like to, and others would as well. It's just, part and parcel now. It's got to be done.
It's got to. I mean, what I loved about 1980s, 1990s football culture, and we'll come on to football as well, because I think everything we're going to be speaking about here in terms of fashion, movements, football and music, it all bleeds into one pot as far as I'm concerned. But growing up, the fanzine culture that I experienced in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, that fanzine culture still exists to this day. People still print up magazines, fanzines, stand out in the rain when you're allowed to go to the football and sell them. But there's got to be a time, and some of them have already done it, where they've got to transfer that into a digital platform, which is probably against everything that they wanted to achieve in the first place. But I just think it's about embracing and enhancing your product.
I think so. I think, there's two ways you can look at it. And I think, realistically, if you want to get on with whatever it is you're doing, you've got to embrace the fact this is a digital age now. And no matter what happens, that's not going to change. Do you know what I mean? Technology's there. It's so advanced that you've got to either, embrace it and use it, as you say, to enhance your product. Otherwise, you're just going to fall by the wayside. It's a bit of a shame, probably, to be honest, but that's just how it is now. Do you know what I mean? When you look like talking about fanzines, the amount of people you can reach with a few clicks of a button is just incredible. Whereas it's all well and good, guys obviously using the Brit stick and whatnot to put fanzines together. It's just never going to compete, is it? Especially, I think the other thing as well now, people want to make money out of, well, pretty much anything, to be honest with you. That's a big obsession for people now, which understandably, but what are you going to do when you can reach millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people and make money out of something? That's what you're going to do. Do you know what I mean? So,
no, you're spot on. And it's about kind of adapting and continually moving within the technological advances. But so, for my brand, if you like, a state of mind, starting off as a football podcast called A Celtic State of Mind, but a football podcast with a difference, where we were looking at different areas of culture, art, football, music. Because again, because you're a football fan doesn't mean you don't appreciate all of these things.
100%, yeah.
And then the podcast itself, very, very quickly, has become secondary to live broadcasting, social media broadcasting. And I think that the important thing about you coming along and telling your story today is to introduce you to people who may be tuning in because they've enjoyed some of our music chats and football chats elsewhere.
Yeah.
What I love about the mod movement is you get almost like a hierarchy, and you get people who are so strictly into mod, and you can't even dip your toe in that water because there's a great film, I don't know if you've ever seen Svengali.
Yes, I have, yeah. Johnny Owen.
Johnny Owen.
Yeah, it's a great film, isn't it?
Johnny has been a guest on A Celtic State of Mind.
Oh, is he? Oh, I didn't know that.
Because obviously he's a great documentary maker.
Yeah.
And through his involvement with picking the music for that film, because the music's brilliant,
it is.
He picked a track called Weed Bus by a band called The Stairs, who existed in late 80s, early 90s Liverpool. And the bass player of that band is Edgar Summertime Jones, who I was speaking to you about earlier. So through Edgar, I managed to get an interview with Johnny, and he was on A Celtic State of Mind. But I love the scene in that film where he goes for a job in the music shop.
Yes,
the guy just challenges him, And you do have that hierarchy, don't you, when it comes 100%. Into a movement?
I think the phrase he uses, Martin Freeman, he calls him a ticket, doesn't he? Which was it. You're just like hitching a ride, basically. You bought yourself a ticket, but you wasn't there, you didn't start it, kind of thing. Which, I mean, do you know what I mean? You're always going to get people who get a bit strict like that from all the subcultures and all the kind of youth situations. But I feel like some people can get a bit too snobby with it sometimes, which I think I don't always like, kind of thing. Like, I think you can be into the mod scene because it's such a broad, well, as Eddie Pillar would always call it, a broad church. And it's, you get mods into soul music, mods into rock music, mods are into punk music, can come up from the mod revival, And I just feel like you can't get too strict because it's too broad. Do you know what I mean? It's too big a scene. But that's also what makes it great. The fact that it is such a big scene and it can encompass so many things. Like for me, I got the train down here today. I was listening to Miles Davis, then Oasis, then, do you know what I mean? Like Luther Vandross, whoever it might be. And all of those are acceptable under the mod banner.
Oh, definitely. I mean, what I loved about, you mentioned a couple of times here, like soul, and we were speaking about the Northern soul scene as well. And it's something that, although I've never been entrenched in it, every time I hear, because obviously within the studio we've got a soul show called Underground Grooves. It goes out once a fortnight. Now these guys are dedicated to their craft. They're dedicated to their craft, and I love seeing anybody who has that dedication, anything they're interested in. Every record they play, I know I could get into it. And then from there, you then start watching online the old Wigan Casino footage, and then you see the dancing and the fashion. Now, I've got to agree with you. I don't think they nailed the fashion back then. Yeah,
a little bit too baggy for my taste, personally. I would prefer the original mod kind of slim cut image. But yeah, the music's great, as you say, to be fair. I think with the Northern Soul scene, it was based largely on like obscure records, whereas obviously you could have mods who's playing the latest sort of Motown or whatever it would be, whereas Northern Soul, got to the point of obsession for a lot of people. Like Stuart Cosgrove, the Scottish broadcaster, like he's written a few books about it as well, which is great. But just the point of obsession. But the great thing about Northern Soul scene, because of that obsession with obscurity, you always find something new and great, especially coming into it from sort of later generations like myself. So yeah, I'm much the same. I wasn't that keen on the fashion. I certainly wouldn't be trying the dancing, but the music is fantastic.
Yeah, see the dancing, it's good to watch.
Oh, it's great to watch. Yeah,
brilliant.
Watch, not try. I think I'd do myself an injury if I started trying that. I think
we've been watching in the studio. We've been watching a couple of girls who do the Northern Soul dancing in their back garden. I think they're called Passion in the Vein.
Right. Yeah.
And to my untrained eye, they look good.
Yeah.
Maybe to some of the aficionados in the scene, they're maybe not as good.
Can't be easy doing in the back garden though. They always said that about the Wigan Casino, and the best bits about it was the floor.
Yeah,
it was that sort of slidey, sort of wooden floor that made it so much easier to do the dancing. So I don't know how easy that would be on sort of grass or stones or whatever it is.
They seem to do all right. We maybe should bring them up here for a wee sesh.
Yeah, sounds good.
You mentioned Weller before. Now, for me, Paul Weller, when I was getting into my music buying kind of age, Weller had disappeared from the scene. Obviously, it had massive success with the Jam. You've got to respect Weller's decision to split up that band when he did. Style Council then ensued, and I think they've aged, a lot of their stuff's aged particularly well.
Yeah.
In actual fact, there was a period when Weller was almost written off. Then he comes back as a solo artist, and after his first, I think he called it the Paul Weller Movement, actually, the first album.
Yeah.
He then embedded himself into this new movement that was coming into the fore, and that was some of the bands you've already mentioned, you know, Oasis, Ocean Colour Scene, and Weller became almost like the mod filer, didn't he?
Yeah, he literally did. I mean, if you look at like the songwriting credits on a lot of those, and sort of who's playing in the background, some of the records, then from the sort of Britpop scenes, we called it, that Weller features in almost all of them, and I think, yeah, like you say, his solo stuff, like my personal favourite album that he's ever been involved in, from the Jam, Style Council, solo, whatever, would be Stanley Road. Do you know what I mean? Like, just when people were really writing him off, he came out with that, which I just think every track's an absolute masterpiece. But I mean, even the Style Council, like I said, to me, Weller, like, he's probably the first person people would think of when they hear the word mod. But I think that's right, and it's fair, because he obviously started up in the sort of mod, well, probably literally started the mod revival himself single-handedly through the Jam, which was more of a kind of punk sound, really. I think a lot of their early following was more a kind of punk kind of scene as well, particularly in London. But when he sort of broke them up, obviously there was outcry, but he then obviously set up the Style Council, which went much further back to like the soul and jazz influences of the early mods. And even if you look at his image around that time, more kind of Ivy League kind of style, and which I just thought was such a bold move, to be honest with you, because I was going to say there was outcry, and I think a lot of people have never quite got over it. But I think a lot of people, if they sort of, well, especially now, will sort of stop and listen to those Style Council records again. Like, I know there's a new anthology coming out, I think it's next month, like sort of greatest hits, and I think it'd be well worth a lot of people sort of buying and getting into that, because actually listening to just how good some of those records are, which I feel like he still to this day doesn't get the credit for, to be honest. But
and I mean, when you look at the clobber that he wears to this day, the hair, and the music, and so prolific as well. Now, going back to the chap I mentioned earlier, Edgar was up here a couple of weeks ago, and he played with Paul Weller, and they toured Europe. He's in one of the actual videos. He's in one of the videos, although he didn't play on the heliocentric album.
Right.
He toured that album.
Oh, wow, okay.
And he was a bass player, and he had a laugh at himself, Edgar, because he says he turned up as a scruffy scouser, but by the time that he had done a tour with Weller, he was very smart, because obviously that rubbed off on him.
Yeah, I think it's probably a few players who can say that over the years, like a few
definitely.
people,
But see, when you watch the action of, let's say, the Royal Albert Hall gig, that Edgar's on the bass, you've got Paul Weller, obviously, Steve Craddock on lead, and then Alan White on the drums.
Yeah, it's just
unbelievable.
a dream team put together, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's unbelievable. I think like Steve Craddock and Weller have obviously collaborated quite a lot over their careers, and again, different eras of mod, you could call it, but it works perfectly. And obviously, like some of the Ocean Colour Scene stuff, some of the best music I think this country's had over the past however many years you want to call it.
It's unfair that a lot of people write them off now, don't they?
I'd
See,
say
when you look at that run of singles they had and albums, back in the 90s.
Well, the first two albums are absolute masterpieces, I mean, and the others are obviously good as well. But no, I think Oasis, especially for people like looking back on that period, like I say, for me, I grew up after that, but looking back in that period, Oasis are obviously so dominant. And then from Oasis, for a lot of people, their next sort of leap would be the Stone Roses to then go and get into that. And then, so that sort of little period of maybe even the Verve, Ocean Colour scene, even though they're obviously, you know, really famous bands with some massive hits and everything else, they probably don't get the full credit they deserve beyond their sort of most obvious hits, I'd say. But then, one good thing about, briefly mention the business here, about me selling records is that you get a lot of sort of younger people now coming in, students quite often, who are getting into sort of vinyl for the first time. And I love the fact that a lot of the records that I sell might be like the Verve, Ocean Colour scene, things like that. And I don't actually sell that many Oasis or, you know, Stone Roses or whatever it might be. Probably because people have already got them. It's a big factor, but it's nice to see sort of younger people getting into Ocean Colour scene and the Verve.
See, when you mentioned the Roses as well, in terms of any band that influenced me, the Roses were the biggest influence.
Yeah, like a lot of people.
Oh, incredible impact on my entire youth, you know, coming through. Even had the hairdo and all that kind of stuff back in the day. And that's when you know that there's a movement, because people start dressing like the musicians, they start wearing the hair like the musicians, and inevitably, and I didn't, but they start taking the drugs that the musicians are talking about. So the Manchester scene, it was ecstasy, you know, Primal Scream, Happy Mondays, and even though the Scream came long before, they were lumped in there with Screamadelica. And then you've got the Britpop, and it was a much more kind of cocaine scene back then. Thankfully, I was a clean living young man and I didn't get into all of that.
To hear it.
But it seemed to go hand in hand, you know?
I think so, yeah. Well, I think, like when you're saying about the Roses there, and obviously the Happy Monday is probably the best example of it, with the ecstasy, obviously Factory Records, the Hacienda was all going on. And that was just as much a part of the scene as the music probably was, to be honest. So, yeah, like you're saying, you'll get God knows how many teenagers and whatever getting into it through that. But then, is there an argument to say that would they have had the careers and the sort of legacy they've had if that hadn't been a part of it? Do you know what I mean? I'm not condoning it. I'm just making the question. Do you know what I mean? But I think, yeah, particularly with that early scene. And then it's one of the things that I don't like so much about the kind of the Britpop scene, Oasis and stuff, is that I think there's a massive focus on the drugs, and they probably didn't do themselves any favours, particularly the Gallagher brothers, by openly admitting to it and sort of flaunting it, to be honest with you. But I was trying to like sort of look past that with their kind of, well, obviously with the music, but also with their kind of style and image as well, because I think that's one of the things that was just, obviously they were young, especially Liam was very young when he first kind of rose to fame, probably didn't handle it as well as he could. But, you know, I try and like look past the drugs with that kind of scene and hope that not too many people are kind of, you know, going to follow into that, if that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. I think the big thing about the scene that Oasis were part of, and other bands, I mean, the obvious one being Blur, because obviously the tabloids put the two head to head and everything else. The music stands the test of time. And that's why, you know, it was more than just the drugs, although that was a big part of that period. And there was a few casualties. A lot of bands lost a lot of their mojo through that. But you're looking at classic albums by Blur, Oasis, The Verve, and various others from that era. And I don't like sticking them in this Britpop kind of category, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely, actually. The music's too good to come under one. And it's very different, like a lot of the music. Like if you listen to Blur and listen to Oasis, I don't hear too many similarities. I mean, don't obviously there are going to be some, it makes sense, like two British bands around at the same time, there's going to be similarities, but I think they're very different sounds. And for the untrained ear who is to listen to each of those two bands, I don't think you'd ever put them two together in a scene. So I agree, I don't really like the term Britpop, but it's one that's just so common that it's a good way of making people understand what you're talking about.
Oh, definitely. As a guy who was working and buying records at that time, it was brilliant. Honestly, there was always another record just around the corner. You were going in and you were buying physical music. Somebody laughed at me the other week because I queued up for an Oasis record on the day of release. Our price in the shopping centre, but that's what you did. You 100%. Were excited about new music coming out, and every time Oasis released a single, it was 4 tracks you got. I mean, the B-sides were unbelievable.
Well, that's been like commented on quite a few times, isn't it? The B-sides were better than the
unreal.
Time, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things I say, again, me sort of selling records now, it's definitely an appeal that's growing again, I think. Now that I think there's whole generations that are growing up without had any experience of that. Do you know what I mean? Even there's certain people, like my kind of age, remember buying CDs, for example, which I don't think that's going to come back in quite the same revival as vinyl will. But so there's whole new generations of people getting to vinyl now, are getting that experience now.
Yeah.
So Paul Weller's album dropped fairly recently, and the new one, and people sort of queuing up to go and get that. And I just thought it was great, to be honest with you. I thought, just that's the way it should be with new music. Obviously, he's getting on in years now, but he's still at the forefront, still inspiring that, which is fantastic.
Yes, I mean, the last few months have been hellish for a lot of people, and the music industry has been hit. Any live entertainment industry, be that comedy, spoken word, they've been hit, shockingly, and some of the venues will never come back from it.
Yeah.
And I've had a conversation with Edgar in relation to how you used to tour to promote an album. Now you release an album to promote a tour.
Yeah.
There's going to be no touring for the foreseeable. There's going to be no gigging. And it's more important now than ever to actually buy the tunes and actually buy the music.
Definitely, from a fan's perspective, you want to save the industry. I mean, the other thing now obviously is sort of YouTube hits and whatever else. I think that's going to play an even bigger factor in terms of, the advertising and whatnot that goes into it. I don't claim to be an expert on the music industry and how it works, but I think as a fan's perspective, obviously it's a hard time for a lot of people financially right now. If you can afford to, buy the records or buy the tunes, like whether it be through streaming or whatever it is, but pay for it, then it's a great way to support, because as you say, the music industry, until there's a vaccine, it's really in trouble, isn't it? The live music industry, I think. I don't see any other way that it can come back without a vaccine, to be honest with you. I know they're doing a lot of these kind of socially distanced pod gigs, which, that's great. That's better than nothing, but it's never going to be a widespread replacement, if you ask me, because people would rather just sit and watch old gigs in their front rooms or whatever it is. So, that's unfortunate. But, anyone who can should definitely get out and try and support in any way possible.
What I love about the music we're speaking about is how influential it is on a huge group of people. It's when you look at a youth generation who are influenced by the Roses and start wearing flares, or putting Jackson Pollock hats on and all this kind of stuff. Then Oasis come along, and there's people in Fife swaggering about calling their wee brother our kid. They're all of a sudden they're from Manchester, right? That happens with bands, and a big part of that is people start wearing the same threads and the same clothes. When you're looking down the musical kind of backdrop in your own journey, which obviously there's a mod element yourself and Fred Perry's a label that from the 70s right up to the present day, it's a staple part of the uniform, isn't it?
Yeah, and they're the best in terms of marketing, because what they've done is they've obviously been identified with youth subcultures dating back to mods, I think, because when mods, I'll say early days, it was, suits, very formal, and then it suddenly became acceptable moving forward. You could wear a polo shirt, but only if it had that laurel wreath on it. And then since then, through Northern Soul, skinheads, even like the casuals in the 80s, it was acceptable. Through obviously the sort of the 90s, the music scene of Oasis, etc. It's always been there and will continue to be. But I think their success in that is because Fred Perry, the brand, has been because they've managed to attach themselves to the music. So now, well, obviously up until COVID hit, they've been doing the Fred Perry subculture stuff, like playlists. And the great thing about that is they've just been doing, a lot of sort of unsigned, unknown artists, giving people a lot of good exposure, but also introducing fans to lots of new music.
Yeah.
And again, they were doing events like predominantly at the 100 Club, which obviously famous, historical venue in London, and they were doing subculture events in there. So they've managed to tie themselves to whole new scenes, if you like, and they've got the infrastructure to do that now. So in terms of marketing, it doesn't get any better than that, I don't think. So a real inspiration for a company like mine, to be honest.
Oh, brilliant. One thing that they did do over the last few years, our big podcast, if I can call it that, the one that got us started, I decided early doors the music is going to be very important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you want to get a tune that if this becomes a success, you're allowed to use. So you need to have something that isn't published and it's not going to cost you a lot of money, because you've got nothing when you start off the podcast. So I got a friend of mine to do the tune, and it's become the staple part of the podcast. People recognise the podcast through the tune. But that band were also given an opportunity by Fred Perry, who released one of their singles, Ace City Racers. So Fred Perry released the single.
That's the thing. They've tapped into a market I'm not aware of other brands looking at at all, to be honest. But as you've kind of said, this music's so integral to fashion, has inspired it in huge, and well, they both inspire each other, to be fair. But it amazes me that not more brands have tried to really tap into that, and definitely not to the level that Fred Perry have. But again, it's great for bands, great for your artists as well. So
it's brilliant, and the way that was recorded, and the fact that the promotional video was done professionally, and it was all down to this support that had been given by Fred Perry. Now you've already explained brilliantly how fashion and music, they're intertwined. There is no denying that they're intertwined, but so's football.
Yeah.
And I think up to a certain stage, football was almost, because it was a working class sport, and the people who were on the pitch were working class, and the people on the terraces were working class, it was almost demonised. And it was demonised in the UK by a Conservative government who stamped down on hooliganism, which did exist. But they stamped down on all football fans. So football, for me, you're looking at styles, you're looking at the clothes and the fashions that people wear, and you're looking at the terrace culture of the 1980s and the music, and it all goes hand in hand. Now, I'm thinking back to the time where you would see Shaun Ryder, who obviously was on tour with the Mondays back in the 80s, and he'd pop up wearing a bright white jersey with a massive big Lacoste sign in the middle. And at that time, you probably couldn't go down the high street and buy it in the mid-80s or whenever that might have been. But all the Scousers had it because they were travelling Europe following Liverpool, right? And that kind of fashion and that influence that the music has on people who are going to the football, it goes hand in hand. So it's great looking at the brand that you've built and you're developing it at this time, where you're actually encapsulating the music, the fashion, and the football. How important is fashion and music to terrace culture?
Oh, it's huge. Like you said, there's a lot of the fashion gets influenced by that. Obviously, the Scousers had their kind of missions to Europe in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, would it have been? But yeah, I think it's a massive part because, well, particularly to say with my brand, I feel like they've always been intertwined, the three of them. And, the same people, like you're saying, working classes from the UK, they've always been into all these things. And it's not a new sort of, intertwining, if you like. So it made sense to me to try and build a brand based on those three things. But yeah, as I said, with obviously, particularly like the casual movement that built up in sort of the early 80s, like fashion was the key element of it. And again, I think we still kind of live in that legacy a little bit because it was really by and large because of that movement, and that a lot of these sports brands, like you mentioned, Lacoste there, but others as well, have become readily available on UK high streets. So obviously negative connotations to the casual scene, but I think that's one of the benefits that people kind of forget about or gloss over sometimes. But and yeah, as you say with the music, like it's kind of well documented sort of towards the end of the 80s that when the sort of acid house scene hit, and which obviously Shaun Ryder, Happy Mondays would be kind of attached to, that kind of melted a little bit or softened a little bit the effects of the casual scene through the effects of ecstasy and whatever else. So I think when those guys are influencing what then comes next in terms of what came after the casual scene, then yeah, it's all intertwined, it all kind of links together, and it always will, to be honest.
Oh, definitely. We had a great discussion in here last week about the different brands that would pop up, and you would see them on the Terrace, and then you see these movies that are obviously being made, and they're looking back and they're trying to recreate that, because a lot of the clothes are really sought after and difficult to get. And the wardrobe department does a great job with these movies. Some good, some bad. And some of the things, like, for example, people of a certain age will think of Kappa and go, oh, that was just neddy. There was a certain moment in time where Kappa was worn by Damon Albarn, and you couldn't buy it. You certainly couldn't buy it freely in the UK. It became a tracksuit that ended up on Little Britain and all that kind of stuff, and it became a neddy kind of label, which is a shame.
It's already coming back a little bit, to be fair. I mean, not obviously to the extent of your LSs or feelers, but it's still there a little bit. And a lot of your kind of, I'm going to use the word hipsters, I don't particularly like the word, but I can't think of another one. But I'm talking like for the sort of modern kind of youth subcultures, if you like, will be wearing those kind of Kappa. Kids often not from, poor backgrounds, kids often from wealthy backgrounds, but seem to be trying to dress down and go in with the kind of Kappa tracksuits and whatever else. And I think that's the new kind of style as far as I can make it out. So there's always going to be revivals for these brands. And like you're saying there, Fila, obviously Sergio Tacchini, LS, they're back in demand as much as they ever were right now, so, which is obviously great for me considering I sell them. But
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I do genuinely have people come into the shop sometimes asking for Kappa, which I'll be honest with you, it took me by surprise a little bit, but apparently it's there, so might have to look into it in the future.
Well, what I think happened was the Italian football clubs of the 80s, they had the coolest kits. I mean, you think of Juve and Inter Milan, AC Milan, and you had certain brands like Kappa made a lot of the jerseys. As did Neri, which were the coolest shirts, especially the Roma ones. And there was a few other brands, but they then became fashionable. So if you could get a tracksuit with that, brilliant. But then it sometimes goes the wrong way. And some of the brands have to get pulled back from the dead almost, because things like Burberry became Nedish with a cap and all that. And they've obviously got to look at that and bring it back to a different market.
Yeah, but they've obviously kind of had to reinvent. And to be fair, Burberry have been really successful at it. But then I suppose when you're that premium kind of brand, it's not the hardest thing to do. But I mean, even I'd argue with that check that you're saying, the original sort of check, or that check in the 90s, early 2000s that became really sort of chavvy or Nedish or whatever you want to call it. Again, I think that's back in demand more than ever right now. Most people want that rather than the new, more updated checks that they've been producing in the last sort of 10, 15 years. So I think you start to see, if you go to certain like premium brand stores now, you'll see a lot of that original check again. So everything just comes back. It's always going to be revivals, and there's always going to be, you know, it's just going to keep turning kind of thing. So, and especially like you mentioned the films there, that's a massive part of it. Like obviously the Football Factory probably helped a little bit with the, I suppose that was early 2000s, but still you have a certain like customer or clientele who are going to want that off the back of films like the Football Factory. Obviously with the business and then later the firm, we've really seen the explosion of Fila, Sergio Tacchini, LS, all these kind of brands, and that is pretty much solely off the back of these films, because they hadn't been seen for 15, 20 years before that, really, or certainly not in a fashionable kind of sense. So
what I'm waiting for, and this is before your time, so apologies in advance, I want the resurrection of things like SPX, Troop, Joe Blogs, Chippy, Naf, Travel Fox. I want all them to come back, because I mean, back in the day, they were sought after.
Make a film, there you go.
They might be hard to come by, to be fair. Now, everything we've been talking about, we've got shared interests, and we're trying to put this out there as a state of mind. So our love in music and fashion, comedy, football, and bring it all in together under a state of mind banner. You're doing it in a different way, and you're doing it in such a way that we've kind of been hooked on your social media, looking at the imagery that you've got.
Good to hear. Must be doing something right.
I mean, the title of this is "It Started in the North with a State of Mind," almost as if we started it. That's the name of your brand. It started in the North. Now, tell us about the birth of that brand.
But so it'd been sort of in my mind for a while. Took a little while to kind of come to fruition. But well, the name "It Started in the North" actually came about as a running joke, to be completely honest. But before people get put off by that, I actually love it, because I don't think you can take yourself too seriously in these things. Otherwise, you know what I mean, it's just not going to work. But originally we'd considered the name Talk of the North, which was the name of a sort of Northern England-based mod fanzine in the 70s. And I always loved the name, but I was a little bit concerned. We did sort of mock-ups of the logo. I was a little bit concerned it could be misconstrued and not enough people would kind of get the reference. Whereas It Started in the North, I know it had been used, we mentioned earlier about the sort of Scousers who basically began the casual scene by their sort of little trips across to Europe. And I know some of them had used, like fans of both Scouse teams, had used T-shirts or had T-shirts made up in the early 90s. Basically, It Started in the North, about the casual scene. And I loved the name. I'm not involved in the casual scene. I'm not trying to lay claim to that at all, but I just loved the name. I thought it was original. I thought it was something different. And the kind of font and the style of logo we've used, I think is not something you traditionally associate with a casual scene. So it's kind of a play on it in the sense that we've used a more mod-based font, for lack of a better term. And that's literally all it was. But the idea behind it was always, like been talking about there, sort of fashion, football, music, art, culture, and things that I think have gone hand in hand, have always been intertwined in sort of UK culture from 50s, 60s onwards kind of thing. So that was basically how the brand began. And I wanted it, as I say, to be a brand, obviously a serious brand in terms of we're a serious business, but at the same time it's tongue in cheek. Obviously I'm based in Edinburgh. I have the most southern accent in Edinburgh possibly. So again, another example why it's tongue in cheek, not to be taken too seriously.
Where can we find you?
Easter Road, 138 140 Easter Road. So literally just around the corner from Hib Stadium. So we will, or hopefully sooner rather than later, be getting busy again on match days. But had a really good time considering how bad things have been generally for the country and the world as a whole, to be fair. So we should be there for the long term anyway. So.
Well, we were blown away by the imagery and the style of the brand, so well done to that, and we hope it's going to grow and progress over the next few years. Now, what we have done is we've actually stolen one of your bits of art or one of your images, and it's going to be on our vehicles as well. So I never asked you for permission, but I'm just letting you know we have done that.
I'm sure we can grant permission.
So it'll be on there. But everybody who is in the area can come and visit you. But we can also visit you on Instagram and Facebook as well.
Yeah, Instagram and Facebook. We would like to go online for a full-on website to sell in the future. It is in the works. I get asked that question a lot. It is in the works, as I say. It's just a little bit of complications, and we want to make sure we get it right. It's very easy to just set up a website and think you can run it and just sell everything online, but